Okay, my name's Evan Scheibel for CG Toots Plus, and in this tutorial we're going to take a kind of an in-depth look at Maxwell Render for 3D Studio Max, as well as Maxwell Studio, which is a standalone application that kind of performs in a similar way as does the plugin for 3D Studio Max, except you have a few more options and a dedicated UI and just kind of some things that you won't get in the plugin. Now, both have their drawbacks and both have their perks. Depending on what 3D package you're used to working with, whether it be 3D Studio Max, Maya, Cinema 4D, whatever it might be. Even I'm not sure if Blender has support. I think there's some Python scripts and stuff that can take geometry and whatnot back and forth. You'd have to look at that. But the plugins for those packages are really in-depth, really extensive. So we can't really cover everything, but we can look at creating the scene and what goes into that creation that you saw in the preview image. So let's just kind of go and we'll just kind of wing it through and see if we can come up with a similar, if not the exact same result. We're going to look at materials, lighting, kind of discuss some different concepts like ambient occlusion, soft shadowing, and things like that, and just go through kind of the workflow of Maxwell. Okay, so you can see here I just have a teapot and a ground plane. Now, I've set my renderer already to Maxwell, and the way to do that, obviously, is you just hit F10, and right here's our settings. In the Common tab, you just come down, and in Assign Renderer, you have all your options. So, and here Maxwell's obviously not shown because I have it selected. So when you do this in your material previews, you'll see you get this box right here, no preview. But what I've done is I've come into my material and map browser here, and I've just drug out a Maxwell material, which is here. Now in Maxwell version 2, we have what's called Maxwell Material Reference. And what this does, it gives us, I don't use Max 2010, at least not exclusively just yet, but it's really useful for Max 2010 where you have really upgraded viewport shading. But that's essentially what that is it's a reference material for the viewport that kind of gives you a clue into what the render will look like in the viewport. So kind of like real time, if you will. But so we have both of those, and what I've done is I've just drug out a Maxwell material in the top row and my reference materials here. We won't be using the reference materials too much. I just wanted to describe what that is. And essentially what you're going to do if you want to use the reference materials is you apply this material to your geometry, and then you apply your main material for rendering. So it's kind of useful if you want to see, in a large scene what you're going to get, at least in a semi-finished way. So anyway, and then what you have to do is you'll see if you want to get let me import from my library here. See, we have some viewport issues here because of the OpenGL. But anyway, what we have here is the material browser with that comes with Maxwell. It has the default Maxwell material library, and as well as anything that I've created or anything that you've created you'd put in there as well. You can also link other libraries and just browse your entire system from here. But I'm just going to grab let's say we'll just get right to it here, and I'm going to grab a kind of a glass material. Just double click and then just pick which one you want. I'm going to pick this bottom one here, and it's going to bring it here. Now let's say I make a change to that. Let's say I come down here and I make a change. Let's say I change my reflection to a little lighter blue. You see, you get this little exclamation point. The way to get rid of that is just double click, and what it's going to do is call up the renderer, the Maxwell renderer, which is an entirely separate application, and it's going to render a preview of that material. It's going to do it here, but you'll see it's also going to update it here. That's really useful. Just doing it again here. Wait for that to finish. Okay, so really useful if you want to get a nice preview of your material there. And what I'm going to do now is apply this just the same way I would apply any material to my geometry. Now I have lit wireframe on here. Let me change it to smooth plus highlights. Okay, so I've applied that material there, and what I'll do now is just for demonstration, I'm going to call up the renderer, and so you can see kind of how this works. So you do it just like you would call up Final Render or Maxwell Render or Mental Ray. You just hit render, but the difference in Maxwell is, you'll see here we've got this oversized window. Not too much I can do about that because every time it calls it, it does it differently. But you'll see what happens here is it calls up the Maxwell Render application. Make some room here. And so it's going to give us a representation of what we have. It's going to render that out. And the good thing about this is you can minimize this and let that render, and you can still work on your scene here in Max because it's called up an entirely another application. So that's good, and that's always useful. Kind of operates the same way as like PR Man or 3D Light or something like that, where it calls up, you know, an external app. You can do this also from the command line. I'm not going to get into that. I don't do command line stuff in Windows, only Linux. So I just generally work, you know, default workflows, but in Windows anyway. But anyway, so you can see what this is doing, and I'm going to stop this. And the good thing about Maxwell 2 is that you can see already barely any render time, and at 100% zoom, you can see it's, you know, it renders a lot faster than the first versions did, and with a lot less grain. Okay, so let me get rid of my viewport issues here. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do is import another material, and again, it's going to bring up our material browser, and this one's going to be for our ground plane. Now, you know, it all depends on what you want to do. I'm just going to do, let's do it interesting here. Let's throw in find a tile, just like our, so I'll come into mine, and I will grab, let's see here, which one should we do? We'll grab this one here, this small mosaic blue. We'll throw this on our ground plane. Okay, and you can see we have you know, a decent representation of our texture. I want to make some changes to this texture, however. I don't want it to be blue, but rather than go through, you know, and adjust all these colors, in Studio, what I'm going to show you is how you can invert these textures, which is one of those features that is not too upfront within the material editor here in Max, but I'm sure it's here. But I'm going to show you how to do that when we go into Studio. And for right now, I'm going to leave this here. And just let's do another render now, so you can see this is just default settings. Remember, we haven't even added a camera yet. We haven't done anything really too extensive besides add materials. Okay, and it's looking, you know, pretty cool already. Not quite what we're looking for, not quite what we want, but you know, hey, it's looking good for just default settings. So I'm going to stop it. And okay, so now let's add a few things here that we're going to need. We will add a camera. So, or actually, we're in a camera. So let me come to my perspective view so you can see what we have here. Now, one thing that's really, really important in Maxwell is to remember your focal distance, and because you're working with depth of field that's completely automatic. So what you want to do is make sure that you have your focal distance set right. So there's a few ways to do that. The way I like to do that is just to grab the target. So if we bring up our hierarchy and grab the camera target, you can move that around, and it automatically will adjust your focal or your focal distance. So kind of bring it. You know, I can show you here too. If we bring that, you know, way out, so it's a little past the teapot, you can see that what Maxwell is going to do is automatically calculate that depth of field, and it's going to, if we render the right viewport, that is. So I'm going to lock my render here to the camera. Why isn't that showing up? Alright, so now if we render this now, you'll see the depth of field is automatic. You can see our teapot's going to be blurry, and back around in this area here is going to be our focal distance and our focal view. So you have to really be careful when dealing with your camera, because Maxwell is, essentially it's made to create a simulation of a photographic environment. What I mean by that is, like, say you're going to set up a camera on a tripod and you're going to take some pictures. Well, Maxwell is set up to simulate that. So you want to set up your camera just like you would in real life, and all of those different things. Now this is all going to make a lot more sense when we come into Studio, because Studio is a lot more upfront with that aspect of Maxwell. So right now what I'm going to do is take this scene here, and I'm going to export this out for Maxwell Studio. The way we're going to do that is right within the plugin, right in the renderer actually. So I'm going to come into my renderer, and let's take a look at these settings before we do the final export for Studio. Now you have all of this in general settings. What we're going to look at mainly for this tutorial is just the MXS output. So we'll check that, and we're going to get our scene here. One second, let me turn on my file exchanger here. Okay, and then what we're going to do is just specify our output here. And file, scratch, other, Maxwell, and we'll just do it right here. And just call it teapot, and we'll save that, and that's going to specify our output here. And all this is fine. We don't have to really mess with that too much for what we're going to be doing. Now this viewport here, the sky preview, if we turn that on, what it's going to allow us to see is kind of a rough preview of what the sky looks like. Now this is really important because, as you could see in our rendering, what we had there was the light from the sky and the sun reflecting on that image. So if we come in and we look at our other settings here, specifically our environment settings, you can see we have a lot of interesting options here. The main one that you're going to find yourself using, unless you're doing really specific work, is this right here, the geographical location tab. I find myself in here more than any other setting when it comes to the environment. And what you can do is you can come through here and you can pick from hundreds of cities in the world. So almost any major city you can think of, you can pick from. So I'm going to pick Pasadena. I lived here once, and right now obviously it's dark, but you can click current date and current time. So if I click that and current date and current time, you see it's going to give us a pretty accurate representation of what it actually looks like right now in Pasadena, California. And right now it does look like that. So just about dark, and if we render this now, you're going to see a huge difference in our image, and you're going to see now kind of the life coming out of it. We still have to adjust our camera a little bit, so you can see a huge difference that made. So I'm going to stop that. Okay, and so that's the most important thing when it comes to that. Now this is a lot easier to deal with in Studio, so I'll show you a little more in that. We're not going to deal with tone mapping or image-based environments right now. Simulens we're not going to deal with, but what we're going to do now is export this into Maxwell Studio. But before we do, let me again come out and adjust my camera. Now this is important because you want to set your scene up as close as you possibly can to what you need for Studio. So you want to get it nice, and so we'll bring that about there. Looks good. And make sure you have the millimeter set for your camera. Let's say we'll do for this one 40 or 35 millimeter. And again, we're going to do more specifications for that when we get to Studio. Okay, camera 1. And that looks decent. It could be a little better, and we'll deal with all this when we get to... Actually, what I'm going to do first is scale my teapot up. And then make sure it's still on the ground. Okay, and from here, what I'm going to do is take this into Studio, and we are going to look at kind of the more interesting portions of Maxwell Studio. So the way to do that is very, very easy. Whoops. Just hit F10, bring up our render settings, and right here, our output. What we're going to just do is hit render. And that's going to automatically create for us a Maxwell scene file in the directory we specified. So let's just kind of take a look at what we're getting here. Just really simple. You can see automatically we're getting these nice refractions on the ground, some nice, or caustics I mean, on the ground, some nice refractions inside this glass teapot. Just some really nice automatic things here. Now, one other thing actually I want to do is I want to tile this texture on the floor here. So this is much easier to do within Max's material editor here, because we can just hit tile. So I'm going to tile this like 5, I think. And you have to make sure to do that every place that bitmap is found. And I think that's pretty much the only one there. So let's see if it's anywhere else. We'll check here. The map is also there, so we'll tile that the same. What happened there? Oh, 51. We don't want 51. We want 5. Maybe we'll leave it at 1. Okay, well, let's leave that there for now. Alright, we'll do a preview here and see what we got. And we should be ready now for export. You know, 5 might have been a bit too much, actually. Kind of small now. So we'll stop this. And we'll come here. Oh, we got 51 there too. That's our problem. Alrighty. Okay, and you could see there, if you saw what just happened where my viewport error, but that was kind of good there, because you can see, you can see we have our scene, and it's really large. Now this is purposeful because the scaling in Maxwell, you can see here's the grid right here. The scaling in Maxwell is a lot different than it is in Max. And you'll find yourself scaling your scene around within Maxwell Studio if you don't kind of set it up larger than you normally would within Max. So that's just something to keep in mind. In global parameters here in the material, let's see. Everything looks fine now. So let's take a preview and we will export this now, I think, regardless of what we've got. Just for time's sake. That's fine for now. I'm going to stop it. The export is already done. It writes the output for us. And now we will come into Studio. Okay, now forgive the kind of crunched UI here. Normally, you know, obviously it's not like this, but because of the resolution of this screen capture, we've got some screen real estate problems. So normally it's a lot easier to deal with. So everything's here that comes default on the UI. So what I'm going to do is go to File, Open, and I'm going to navigate to what we just saved here, other Maxwell, and there it is, Teapot, and you just hit Open. Yes, oops, cancel. Open. Alright, let's do this now. Don't want to save our changes, and there we have it. And then you can see we're in perspective view right now. To change to our camera view, you just come up here to the little view thing, hit this, and hit camera 1. And there we have it. Now, you can see right off the bat, obviously this is a lot more a lot easier to get around the specific Maxwell things. You'll see over here, back to our environment properties, what we were dealing with before, right here, you can see here we have a really nice globe we can kind of navigate around rather than be limited just to those specific cities. So when it comes to this here, we can get around a lot easier, kind of find a specific place we want to be. And so that's really nice, that's handy. And then you have all of these things here that reflect directly upon your environment. We're not really going to go into those because that can take up an entire tutorial itself. So you can see everything has come from Max to Studio very nicely. We've got both of our objects and our materials. Everything looks good. So what I'm going to do now is kind of show you what I meant before about our material. So you can see here we have our material editor. It's a little bit different because it's in Maxwell. Now, Maxwell has a few different specific applications that comes with it. You've got the material editor, which is a standalone. You've got Studio, you've got Render, and you've got another one. But so the material editor we're not going to go into because, again, that's a whole nother issue. But in this one you have a few basic things that you can kind of do. So what I'm going to do is right here you can see when this is highlighted, that means there's a texture applied. So I'm going to click on that and it's going to bring up the texture picker. Now I'm not really going to do anything too drastic, but I'm going to click right here, invert. Now that's going to take the blue and just give us the inversion of that color, which is kind of a reddish burnt orange type color in this case. And I'm just going to close that out, double click on the material preview here, and you can see now we're going to get, you double click again to stop that, but now we have to tile our reflection here because that's obviously not looking right. So if we come here, we'll repeat that 5 and 5. There we go. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. We can also change the way we want this to be viewed. Rather than a sphere, we can, since we're using it as a floor, it makes sense we'd want to preview this as it would look on a floor. So we can go to Select Scene, Floor, and then double click and it's going to give us the preview. Okay, kind of funny looking here. We've got the small little tiles, but I kind of like that. It looks kind of interesting. We'd have to go back to Max. We can do that here, but it's I'm not going to go that far because it kind of looks cool. So now what we can do is we have a few different options for looking at our renders. We have this button here, which allows us to render a region within the screen. We have this here, which allows us to render the viewport, and then we have this render button, which calls up the external renderer. So I've been getting runtime errors with the render region, but just for the tutorial's sake, I'm going to risk it and I'm going to render this region. Now, what that's going to do is, just like anything else, it's going to just show us that region. And it looks like it's working fine, so we're good. And it renders just like it would in the renderer, except we have just that portion. So if you're doing individual tweaks to, like, let's say the material, you want to see how it reacts right here. Well, then you can just highlight that, tweak the material, render, and do that over and over again. To stop the render process, you just click in the viewport, and it renders the next shader level and then stops. This one renders the entire viewport. You just click it, it goes. This one calls up the renderer. Now the rest of this is pretty self-explanatory when it comes to these buttons up here. You've got, move, rotate, scale. You can move the pivots, the world. But another important thing that you don't find right here that you're going to really need to get eventually is in your edit tab here you have scale scene. Now if you bring that up, the current scale of the scene is 1. And if you scale the scene up to, let's say you scale it up 5 times, the next time you bring up the scale factor dialog, it's going to say 1, because at that point the scaled up version will equal 1. So that's something to keep in mind when you scale your scene. It's not going to say 5 when you reopen the dialog. So the thing is here, we kind of did it in Max, but normally you would come in here and scale your scene up if you have to. We shouldn't have to in this, however. Okay, another really important thing we're going to look at here is our camera 1 parameters. Now, this is a really cool portion of Maxwell Studio that, again, you could take an entire training video to really get into it. So we're just going to kind of fly through the basics here. Now this is all of the options that you would find in a photography camera, and you have a lot of different settings. So you can come in here and under sensor, you come in here and you can see you have all the major brands of of cameras: Canon, Fuji, Kodak, all of this here. And if you come in here, you get flyouts, digital, SLR, and compact. So you can come in here and grab like a 5D Mark II, or we'll grab that, and you can see it changes just a bit. Shutter angles, everything changes to match what that camera would be. So let's change our focal length to 35 millimeters, and then you can come out here and by holding Alt you can navigate your camera around just like you would a 3D view. So you can kind of position your camera the way you want it here. A little front there. It's always important to remember the rule of thirds when dealing with photography. Just kind of mentally, I guess, split up your canvas or your image here into 6 squares. Put it, or no, 9 squares, I think. You put 2 lines here, 2 lines here, or something like that. But anyway, pretty much split it up into thirds, and you want your main features to be either in the very center of the square or at the intersections, which that will make your image the most visually appealing when it comes to composition. And most of you probably already know that if you're working in the design field, hopefully. But anyway, now in our camera settings we can set all of this stuff, which is really cool. Another thing that we will want to keep in mind is our focal distance. Now, I'll show you what I mean, and I'll see if we're going to have the problems that sometimes arise with the focal distance. Okay, you can see we're dealing with 2 cameras here. So let's take our view and just delete this camera. We'll just deal with this one here. Now, you'll see we're dealing with meters here. So if I hit this once, you can see it flies out there. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you can come in here and say 0.3. It's going to bring it back. You can, but you don't really want your scene to be that dramatically, small, you could say. I'll show you why here. If we grab our focal distance and change it to 0.1, let's say 0.2. Let's bring it out just to where it touches the teapot. So 0.29, 0.26. Okay, and we'll do it there, and we'll hit a render. And while that's rendering, I'm going to save, just so we don't lose anything. Oops, did it again. Got to make sure to have your right view selected here. Render that. All that was a warning that our current TGA file or Targa file will be overwritten in the render, which is no big deal unless you're doing versioning. So if you're not versioning this, just go ahead and overwrite it. But if you want to do versions, just change your output to a different file name. Okay, so you can see our depth of field, is pretty heavy. our tile is messed up here. That's just a tiling issue when we brought it in from Max. I'm not going to fix that. You can do that. But you can see we have heavy depth of field now. This back is blurred right out, and the front is really crisp and clear. Now, if that's what you're going for, hey, that's fine. But in this case, what I'm going to do is stop this. I'm going to scale my scene up. So edit, scale scene, and I'm just going to do it to 2. And all cameras will be modified? Yes. That way everything pretty much stays the same except the scene gets bigger. So now you'll see when you come into the perspective view, and when we grab our camera, you can see now it still jumps, but not quite as far. If you look here, you know, it doesn't go quite as far as it would otherwise. So we can go to like 0.75 or 0.5 now, which is probably about where we'd want it to be. We'll try 0.55. That's good. Okay, and we'll come back in here and we'll render a preview. Overwrite our TGA. And that looks a little better. You can kind of get a preview here of what it'll look like ahead of time because this is smaller resolution. Now, one thing with the render application here, a few different things, is if you use your middle mouse button and double click, you probably can't see it, but what it did is it threw this up full screen. And kind of gave us, just so we can get it in a different atmosphere, I guess you could say, and kind of see it in a little different view than just that render window with all the controls. So that's pretty handy. And one thing I closed out here is multi-light. Now, it's not enabled at this time, so let me enable multi-light and kind of explain what that is. Whoops. Exit. Okay, over in our, down here you'll see 2 little tabs. In our render options, you can see a thing here, all these different things. Okay, well, before we do that, this is really important. Maxwell Render doesn't render like normal renderers. You'll see, like, usually you have buckets that go across the screen, and you'll have a square at a time pop up, and it renders, and however long the render takes, that's how long it takes. You can't do much about the render time besides optimization. Well, Maxwell's a little different. It renders based on voxels. So you'll see that the scene is voxelized at the very outset of the render, and then it comes up as kind of little pixels at a time. And the whole image comes up and then begins to get clearer and clearer. That's because Maxwell Render is pretty much unbiased. So it works in that way. And it doesn't work based on, you know, this render will take this long. Rather, you can set the time limit for Maxwell to work. So right now we have it set to 30 minutes at a sampling level of 12. Now these work hand in hand. If you set the sampling level at 2 and a 30-minute render, it's only going to render to and it's only going to render 2 shader levels and stop. So no matter how long you have it set to render, it's only going to get as clear as 2 shader levels will allow it to get, if that makes any sense to you. So the thing to do is to, if you want a crisp, clear, nice render, set it to about, depending on your scene, of course, set it to about 90 minutes at a sampling level of around 24 or 36. That I've found to be really, really good to work with. For now, we're just going to leave it at default because we're obviously not going to have a tutorial that long. Now, you might say, wow, that's a long render time, but really it's not. For the quality of the image you get from Maxwell and for the realism that it brings and just kind of the ease of workflow as well, you know, that's nothing. That is absolutely nothing because you get to the point of rendering your image that much quicker as you would with something else. So it's really, when you boil it down, even if you compare V-Ray or Final Render with Maxwell, really the times are almost the same when it comes to testing and things like that, and tweaking settings in V-Ray, or, you know, just throwing it into Maxwell, adding your materials, tweaking your materials, setting your location, hitting render, and letting it go. It all boils down to, you know, just about the same. Okay, so I'm going to enable multi-light. Now you have 2 options, intensity and color and intensity. What this is going to allow you to do is edit your lights post-render. So I'll show you what that means. I'm going to enable color and intensity and then hit render. Now you'll see here in our multi-light tab here, we've got some more. Well, let this go for a couple shader levels. But you can see here we've got some more settings: ISO, shutter, and environment. Little sliders here. I'll stop this now. Okay, so you can see what we've got, and you can see the preview here. Now, this is the environment light. Now, we don't have any lights in our scene, like light emitters in our scene, so we don't have anything that we can adjust the color on. That might come later in another tutorial, but in this tutorial, we're not going to cover that. That's for more interior and night scenes. But we have our environment, shutter, and ISO. So if we go up, let's just bring this up. You can see we're not rendering, and we're not in our application. We're in our renderer, and the render's finished, as it were, but we can make the environment brighter. And then if we hit refresh, it's going to add that to our our image here, which is really, really cool and really handy. And this is also completely animatable right here. So you can see it come through, and if I come to the first frame, hit auto key, and then come to the last frame, bring this back down to 100, you can see now over here in our preview, as we play through, the light dims. So you can do that, without having to animate a light within your 3D application. You can do it all right here. And it's going to calculate pretty much exactly the same as it would if you rendered it that way. You can also adjust, your shutter or your ISO here. So bring that down. That looks kind of neat. Bring your environment light up some more, and you can just get all sorts of cool stuff here. And then the shutter on the camera. You can just all sorts of neat stuff you can do, and all of this is completely animatable. So, which is really, really neat and a cool feature of Maxwell Renderer. Okay, so that's pretty much like the basics that you need to know to really get started with Maxwell Studio and the workflow between Maxwell Render and 3D Studio Max. This will get you up and running and get you where you need to be. I hope this was helpful. I'm planning another tutorial, hopefully on an interior lighting scene. That's going to take a while to build, obviously. So look forward for that one. Hopefully right here on CG Toots. Hopefully. So yeah, thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments on this video, and I'll try my best to answer them. I'm not the Maxwell Studio guru, but I probably can answer your questions. Yeah, so thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful, and stay tuned for more tutorials.